Hello, everyone. Good evening and good morning, wherever you may be tuning in from. On behalf of the Stimson Center and the 38 North Project, thank you so much for joining us for today's conversation about North Korea's energy challenges and potential for future cooperation. My name is Esther Im. I'll be moderating today's panel. I'm a senior policy advisor on peace and security at Foreign Policy for America, where I lead our advocacy work on North Korea, Iran, China, and arms control. I've worked closely with the Stimson Center and 38 North over the years, and so I'm really honored to have been asked to help lead this discussion today. And I'd just like to note at the top, today's program is made possible with generous support from the Uni Korea Foundation. So our panelists today include Martin Williams, Natalia Slavny, Robert Carlin, and Anne Harrington. And I'm just going to briefly introduce our panelists now, but I encourage you to read their full bios later online. Martin Williams is a senior fellow at the Stimson Center, where he works primarily with the 38 North Project. His research interests are in North Korea's technology, infrastructure, its broadcasting system, and propaganda. And in 2010, he launched North Korea's tech website and has closely followed North Korea's steps into the global internet. Natalia Slavny is a research analyst at the Stimson Center and also the assistant editor for 38 North website. Her research experience and interest include humanitarian aid, international law, human rights, inter-Korea relations, US-DPRK relations, digital surveillance, technology and information controls in North Korea, and North Korea's economy. Bob Carlin is a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Center, and he's been following North Korea since 1974 from both inside and outside of government. And he's taken part in countless hours of negotiations and unofficial discussions with North Korean officials. He's traveled to the country more than 30 times, and he's notably served as a senior policy advisor at the Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization, KEDO, from 2002 from 2006. Ms. Anne Harrington is a principal at Harrington Consulting. She's an internationally recognized expert on reducing the threat of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear nonproliferation and security, and science engagement for nonproliferation. She's previously worked at the U.S. Department of State, the National Academy of Sciences Committee on International Security and Arms Control, and the Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration. We'll begin today's program with two presentations by Martin and Natalia. I will then have a moderated discussion with our entire panel, and then finally we'll open up for audience Q&A. Our program today is expected to run for about an hour and a half. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Martin to start his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esther, and good evening to everybody, and thanks for joining. We started this project on the North Korean power situation a couple of months ago, and I knew a little bit about it before we started. I've learned a lot about it with all of the research we're doing, and we found it to be a really interesting part of North Korea's economy, but also a really vital one, because obviously the availability of electricity has a direct impact on the individual lives of all North Koreans. So what I wanted to do today is just get started with a PowerPoint here. And we're going to be looking, first of all, I wanted to give you an overall sort of view of the energy situation in North Korea. And I mean, I'm sure as many of you know, the energy situation in North Korea is not good. We've, in researching this project, sort of taken evidence initially from escapees. Now they've told us that, nowhere in North Korea gets continuous electricity supply in the home. Even in Pyongyang, they talked about rolling blackouts, maybe 6 to 8 hours a day of assured electricity, but the rest of the time it was possibly there, but it was probably not. And then as we get out towards the countryside, and especially up towards the northern border, we've spoken to people that were literally only getting electricity on 1 day a year, that day being New Year's Day. And they were very clear on why they got electricity on New Year's Day. And it was, of course, because Kim Jong-un gives his speech on television. So they were all expected to watch. One of the reasons that North Korean citizens get such a bad time of it when it comes to electricity is that the state funnels a lot of the power towards other things that it considers important, such as major industrial plants and the military. So we got that from talking to escapees, but there are other things we've looked at to sort of back this up. And so you was this picture, which I'm sure you've seen something like this before. This is an image from August last year, and this is an average of the lights visible from North Korea throughout the month of August. You can see a sort of faint series of dots there in Pyongyang. And apart from a couple of other dots around the country, one being up in Samjeon, which was recently redeveloped, there's a lot more electricity up there now. And then the Kondok mining complex we can see on this. There's not really anything else going on that we can see. If we zoom in on this picture, we can start to see some more light, but that's pretty much all major industrial factories and things like that. Everywhere we looked, cities were darker than factories that were nearby. So that also speaks to how factories are getting much electricity and are able to operate and homes don't get some. Obviously, if you compare it with South Korea and China, there's a huge difference. South Korea and China are vastly more industrialized nations, so you would expect that. So we also decided to compare it with a sort of, comparable nation to North Korea. So we looked across Asia and we looked to Myanmar, which is, about on the same development path as North Korea. But if you look into Myanmar, there is considerably more light visible from various different cities. And if you look between some of the main cities here, you can start to make out the road arteries. And that's because of street lighting and lights from cars and things like that, which again, in North Korea, none of this is even visible. So even when compared to its peers, the electricity situation in North Korea is bad. And then the other way that we sort of looked at this was state media. One of the things that if you consume North Korean state media for any length of time, you realize is that they're really keen about writing about new power stations. They're really keen about covering speeches where Kim Jong-un pledges more electricity power for people. And obviously, if everyone was getting great electricity, none of this would be news. None of it would be interesting. So three sort of big indications that kind of talk to how bad the situation is in North Korea. Now, the government doesn't publish any data of its own, but there are a couple of major estimates that are available. One is from Statistics Korea, which is the South Korean government statistics bureau, and the other is from Nautilus Institute. Both of them estimate that renewable energy now makes up more than half of all of North Korea's electricity supply. Most of it is hydropower, and then pretty much the rest of the electricity supply comes from thermal, which in the case of North Korea is mostly coal. Since 1980, if we look at this graph, we can see that North Korea's electricity generation capacity has barely changed at all. And that's really one of the problems here, is that North Korea isn't really generating any more energy. There have been various projects that have stalled, that have been delayed. Of course, back during the era of the agreed framework, there was, the possibility of nuclear power stations coming to North Korea. None of that ever came about. Back in 1980, South Korea was only generating about twice as much energy as North Korea. Now it's vastly much greater. So you can see that this is another one of North Korea's problems. Is it's not just short of energy, but it's getting worse every year because there's just no more energy coming on stream. Over the years, though, the energy policy has evolved, especially during the Kim Jong-un era. When it comes to hydro, the country's abandoned the policy of building mega dams and massive power stations, and is now increasingly concentrating on small-scale hydro that can serve a local area rather than cities far away. This is an example of sort of one of the big power stations, one of the Huichon power stations, number 5, and it was really one of the kind of last mega power stations to be built before North Korea started focusing more locally on hydropower. We think this local focus is partly because that the power stations can be built more quickly. They're also not major engineering projects. They're much more easy to handle. And also it's because the North Korean electricity grid is relatively old and inefficient. So if you can keep power locally, you don't lose as much by sending it across the country. This is the inside of a sort of typical North Korean power station. These green things here are the tops of the generators, so the water is flowing underneath here. And there are the two large generators there that are generating electricity. And we have these, boxes on the side that are regulating the output. And usually there's a little control, and they're very simple affairs. Hydro, by the way, is a great choice for North Korea, because North Korea has lots of mountains, as you know, it has lots of lakes, it has lots of rivers. Hydro is also a really bad choice for North Korea, because, while North Korea has some of the geographical advantages, and of course the power, as it were, for hydro is free because it's just running water, a lot of the rivers in North Korea freeze up during the winter because it gets incredibly cold, especially up in the north of the country, and that affects power output from these stations. So really, quite when in most countries the electricity grid is under its sort of peak demand, North Korea is actually suffering from less energy generation, which again hits the people. There's a lot to talk about hydro. We published a story today on it, and there's another one coming. But one of the things I wanted to focus on really today was solar, because solar is small, but it's new and it's expanding fast. And well, essentially all these hydro stations look the same, but solar, there's a lot going on. So I wanted to talk about that. So this is an example of some solar in North Korea. This is the Pyongyang Mobile Communications Bureau, which is just a administrative building in Pyongyang, and you can see that the front is covered with solar panels there. These sort of industrial arrays are starting to appear more and more on North Korean buildings. Certainly, the majority of buildings do not have them. I don't want to give the impression that these are everywhere, but they are not uncommon these days if you see them on buildings. This is one of the, I'm sorry for the picture, this is the best quality I could find, but this is one of the first, I believe the first solar installation in North Korea. North Korea identified the benefits of solar back in the mid-2000s. At about that time, state TV started reporting on solar energy use around the world, which is usually an indication that the government is starting to push the country in that direction. This is the Central Tree Nursery. In March 2009, a solar panel was reported installed, and then a couple of years later, when Kim Jong-un visited in 2011, this was an image carried on the Rodong Shinmun. It was a very small image, which is why when I've blown it up, it looks so bad. But it's the only image I could find of the thing. But we think this is maybe the first solar installation in North Korea, went in 2009. A couple of years later, or rather, sorry, also in 2011, the North Korean state amended the law on the protection of the environment, and they called for encouraging use of renewable energy. So that was something else that happened then. A couple of years later, that amendment was superseded when North Korea passed the law on renewable energy. So starting to get moving early on in the Kim Jong-un era. So that really kicked everything off. This is the State Academy of Sciences in just north of Pyongyang. They created a natural team, and these are some TV pictures from a couple of years later where you can see engineers working on individual solar cells. So some of the sort of low-level R&D was one of the first things that started happening in North Korea when this law came in and they started looking at solar. And then sort of around the same time, a solar lab at Kim Il-sung University was formed. This is the solar lab. And the university went on to create a company to produce solar panels. And there is at least one other company in Pyongyang also producing solar panels. So while undoubtedly some of the North Korean solar panels do come across the border from China, some of North Korea's solar capacity is actually being developed in the country. These panels are being built inside the country. So this is also, I think, again, another sort of example of how serious the government is at pushing forward some of the solar. So with that said, where are all these panels? North Korea has a couple of impressive solar power plants. This is the Sinuiju solar plant. Take a look at the building, kind of remember what it looks like, because in this next satellite picture, you can just about make out that that is the same building that you just saw. And if we go back to that last picture, down on the right there, you can see these solar panels starting to extend. If we come back to this picture, it's a sort of It's a kind of grey line. It's difficult to see on this image. But these solar panels extend either side, but on the right-hand side, they go much further. And there's the power station, and it's got this long line of solar panels. It is 1.4 kilometers long, and there are 3,594 solar panels. I know because I counted them all on a satellite picture. So that's quite a large solar installation. And this is not feeding, this is not, the power station sits on its own. This isn't a power station next to a factory or something. So this is all energy that goes into the electricity grid up in this part of North Korea. There's also a pretty impressive array at the Kumsanpo fisheries station, which if we look on this map here, the fisheries, the solar station is outlined there, approximately 2,880 panels. The fishery station is the sort of blue building up towards the sort of center left of the image. But this looks like it was decided on after Kim Jong-un came and visited the fishery station in 2015 when it was being built. He decided that it would be a great place for a solar and a wind station. So there's also a wind turbine that you can't really see in this picture. But this was built as a direct response to something that Kim Jong-un said. When it opened, state media said that it supplies hundreds of kilowatts of power. 2015 was kind of Kim's solar year. If you remember, this was just after this new law had passed, and had started doing research, and Kim Il-sung University had started doing research, and he came here and said, and then also he visited KPA unit 1016. This is kind of interesting because this is a solar and a wind installation on a military base. First of all, there were 3 wind turbines, and then a solar farm was added. You can see one of the wind turbines there. It's completely unclear why this military base has a solar farm and wind turbines. North Korea's never said anything about why it's there. We can just see it in satellite pictures, and Kim Jong-un has gone and visited. So it could be some sort of R&D thing. It could be that they're doing something there that requires a lot of electricity. We don't know, but this is also one of the interesting establishments that we've sort of seen in the past that seems to be generating power for the grid or for the community. And then there's also solar panels on industrial buildings. One of the largest, in fact, the largest that we could find is this one, which is the Ryongbyon School Supplies Factory. This is a factory to the west of Pyongyang that does things like pens and notebooks and backpacks and stuff for school kids. This has a massive installation on it. There's over 1,500 solar panels. What makes this factory even more interesting is that usually when large North Korean industrial establishments put up solar panels, North Korean TV and the media go along and do a little story about it. They've never, ever, as far as I can tell, reported on this solar installation, and this is the largest industrial solar installation in the country. The other thing we noticed when we were reporting on this, which I think you can see more clearly, there was a general report on the factory, and one of the shots showed the building in the foreground here with the solar panels on it, but the report wasn't about the solar. So again, there's been nothing on the actual solar. But the other interesting thing is that satellite dish on the roof, which is incredibly unusual in North Korean industry. So it makes me wonder what's going on at this factory and why haven't they talked about the solar and things like that. But we're not getting into that today. But it's an interesting place nonetheless, and it is a massive installation compared to some of the others. So just before I wrap up, I want to show you a couple of other installations. Again, in our stories, we have many more examples, but I don't have time to go through them all here. This is the ice cream factory. This is a new ice cream factory, the Taesongsang Ice Cream Factory near Pyongyang. And these are solar panels alongside. This is kind of much more typical of the installation at most industrial facilities, not like the 1,500 panels we saw before. It's a kind of relatively, mid-sized array. And it seems that in a factory like this, the machinery that's building everything, the machinery that's making the ice cream and things, and the freezing, and that will all be run by grid power. But these things will provide power to do things like run lights, water heaters, keep computers going and stuff like that. So this is the kind of sort of non-core energy needs of the factory will maybe be supplied by these solar panels. And then if we look at the satellite picture, the ice cream factory is on the left, and you can see those 14 sets of solar panels that are pulled out here. Next to it is the Tay Son Sang Spring Water Factory, and they've done things slightly differently, but they've got about 150 panels on the roof. But again, big contrast to that school factory that we just saw. And then the last couple of things I'd like to show you is some solar is also getting into agriculture, especially on some of the large farms. This is a bunch of solar panels at the Unjong Pig Farm, and that seems to be mostly to do with running things like well pumps, to do with running lights and stuff like that. And then I don't know if you remember, but last year, 2 years ago, Kim Jong-un visited this new chicken farm south of Pyongyang. And after he visited, this solar array went up as well. So, solar in some of the larger industrial and agricultural facilities is starting to appear in addition to these power stations. I have kind of been sort of talking about all of this solar, and I must admit, I have not told you the most interesting part, or what I think is the most interesting part, because that is the use of solar panels by individuals. And Natalia is going to talk about that. So Natalia, I will pass it over to you.
Great. So hopefully everyone can see my slides. Okay, so as Martin discussed, North Korea is suffering from an unreliable power supply nationwide. And he's just reviewed some of the major industrial solar and hydro installations, and I'm going to look into the use of civilian solar power in North Korea. So back in 2022, Martin and I went to South Korea to interview approximately 40 defectors about their experience with something completely unrelated, which was state-sponsored surveillance and information controls. But during our interview process, we ended up seeing some very interesting trends related to things like mobile phone connectivity, different parts of the private economy, and also the use of solar power in the civilian sector. And with these interviews and looking at state media and satellite imagery, what we've seen is what seems to be an uptick in personal solar installations, especially over the last decade, where citizens have seemingly given up expecting the government to provide adequate and consistent electricity and are instead trying to take things into their own hands. So I'll look at some things briefly over major challenges and trends in these solar installations across the country. So just for some background, a typical solar panel that's personal in North Korea is installed on a roof or a balcony, and it's connected via a regulator to a large battery. And during the day, the electricity charges the battery, which can then be used on low voltage devices later in the day for appliances, some small, some big. And most of the people we interviewed stated that they used a very small panel, something like 60 by 60 centimeters, which was enough to run electricity to a small appliance each evening, such as a phone, a personal computer, or a portable media player called a Notel. We have a picture here. But this is largely dependent upon one's location in North Korea, the weather conditions, the season, and how much disposable income one has in order to be able to purchase these individual panels. So availability and prices of these panels began improving following the 2012 Pyongyang International Trade Fair. And we've seen reports and heard from defectors that panels can be bought anywhere between $15 to $50 per panel, making them a much more attractive alternative to costly generators and batteries. And according to an article in 2017 from North Korea, personal panels were being actively encouraged. So generally speaking, access to electricity gets worse the farther someone is from Pyongyang and other major cities in the country. So in more remote areas, these solar panels are a necessity for government offices that require power to run through the day, but also for personal use. And because they're so small, they're often difficult to see on satellite imagery. But here, Martin has pulled some examples of panels seen on Chinese social media sites from across the Yalu River. So we can see some panels that are on people's roofs. They're very small. And then here are some more examples of private solar panels outside of buildings by the windows. And these were uploaded to a Chinese social media app. So depending on what kind of home you live in and where you live, it might be easier to put it on the ground, on a pole, or right outside your window, depending on where you get some good sunlight. So many of these communities in more rural areas utilize their close proximity to the border to initiate trade and private economic activity, giving them more hard currency access to purchase and transport a lot of these panels from China. And several defectors we spoke to from these rural regions reported that the panels were a necessity because, as Martin said, the state supplied electricity was extremely minimal and inconsistent, with some reporting that they only received any electricity on national holidays. And here we have a couple more examples of some very small solar panels. So through satellite imagery and some state media, we've also seen that solar panels, like Martin said, are becoming a little bit more commonplace on buildings in order to supplement these electricity shortages. The ones we see on imagery tend to be larger, but we're not sure if that's due to the greater wealth in areas like Pyongyang or major cities, or if residents are pooling their money together, possibly to purchase panels for the whole building that they live in. And in this picture in Pyongyang, we can see some differences between personal and what we think are state installed panels. So the state installed panels are neatly arrayed, evenly spaced, whereas the personal panels tend to be placed a little more haphazardly wherever there's room. And some defectors stated that even in these larger cities, they could only be expected to have a few hours of electricity sponsored by the state, and they had no warning of whether one day they'd have more or less. So for those with extra income, some ended up supplementing their electricity through an illegal power grid hookup to the state's industrial electricity supply, and others in other areas were even able to tap into commercial lines that kept factories running 24/7. So throughout our research and writing up the series, Martin and I were pretty convinced that this uptick in personal panels was a less explicit way for the North Korean government to admit that it was facing some major power limitations. And it was allowing and also sort of forcing its citizens to spend their own time and resources to make sure that they had enough electricity for their day-to-day lives. However, an article that was just published today by NK News has some state media reports showing that the government actually wants to remove a lot of these personal arrays in favor of building and utilizing more community solar farms. And here are just a couple examples of some of these solar farms that we have seen in Korea over the years. One of these is in a very interesting shape and array and integrated into buildings at the Science and Technology Complex in Pyongyang. And then in other areas like South Hwanghae Province, this is a smaller scale solar farm. But based on Martin's analysis from state media, it appears to transfer its energy into North Korea's electricity grid, no problem. So what's next? Based on this report from NK News and some interviews from KCTV, they were stating that personal panels were insufficient in producing energy. And instead, the broadcast suggested it would be more efficient, scientific, patriotic, and more aesthetic to participate in these solar energy farms. And while this kind of goes in opposition to what Martin and I concluded in the article when writing this, many of these issues still remain the same. There's still major insufficiencies in North Korea's power supply. And right now, what they're providing through solar is just not enough. And no matter how many solar farms they wish to open or have citizens utilize, solar is still very restricted to land, highlighting the necessity of alternative energy sources. So 38 North is going to continue publishing on this series on North Korea's energy sector. We're going to continue following the issue, and we always look forward to learning more and look forward to answering your questions today. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Natalia and Martin, for those really interesting presentations. I've certainly learned a lot reading your reports and hearing your presentations. I'd like to invite the audience to, as you've listened to these presentations, start preparing your questions and drop those in the Q&A box, and we'll get to those in a bit. But I'd like to start actually maybe posing one question each to Martin and Natalia before I turn to Bob and Anne and invite them to join this conversation, if that's okay. So Martin, first, I'd kind of like to ask you, you briefly mentioned looking at other developing countries, looking at Myanmar as a way to understand kind of how does North Korea compare. And I'm curious, in that comparison, do other developing countries also similarly have kind of this dependency on hydro generated power versus thermal power, and kind of I imagine developing countries are also coming up against, maybe this is also geographic, but I'm curious to kind of hear your perspective on the ways that climate change is also going to affect that distribution on reliance on hydro versus thermal. And then Natalia, sorry, I'm just going to batch these questions together. Natalia, I wanted to ask you a little bit about you mentioned this kind of report, and obviously it flies a little bit in the face of what you guys are proposing about allowance on civilian use of these portable electric panels, solar panels. But I'm curious, because you've also done a lot of research on surveillance and state control, and do you see this development as another way for North Korea to exert its control over the population and manage its use of electricity? And I apologize to the audience, my voice is going out a little bit. I've been hosting our own conference for a couple of days now and talking nonstop, so apologies. Thank you.
Thanks, Esther. Yeah, it's we first looked at sort of other developing countries just to get a gut check on that nighttime image, because North Korea is so different from South Korea and China that obviously comparing them side by side, it's going to be massively different. So we decided to look at other countries for that. We didn't spend a lot of time looking at the way that other countries generate power, because that wasn't really the focus of the article. But certainly, I think geographic's a big part of it. Hydro needs a lot of mountains. It needs a lot of rivers. There's a reason that, a lot of, say, Canada's electricity generation is hydro, whereas it's much less in the United States. That's for the same reasons. I think solar is gaining traction around the world. The great thing, especially for developing countries, especially poor developing countries like North Korea, is that for something like hydro and solar, the fuel, as it were, is essentially free. Once you put the panel up, you just need sunlight. Once you build the hydro station, you just need flowing water. But that flowing water thing is interesting when sort of we do think about things like climate change. North Korea has seen some issues in the last few years from some of the large typhoons that have gone through. Certainly, there have been multiple cases of bridges across rivers being washed out, even some major bridges, and we've seen at least one dam fail as well. This is all going to have problems if there's too much water, But also conversely, if it doesn't rain enough, then these river levels are very low, and that's also going to be an issue for hydro. So climate change is definitely something that could affect this in a big way. Some of it, I think, can be mitigated with engineering. You can maybe think about building, more dams and lakes and reservoirs, so that if there is less rain, you still have a little bit held back. But we haven't really seen that much in North Korea at the moment. So it's going to be interesting to see kind of how they deal with that, and whether it, ends up just kind of simply making a bad situation even worse or not.
Thanks, Martin. Natalia?
Yeah, so in terms of the North Korean state taking away use of personal solar panels, I do think that there is an indication that this is about exerting control. A lot of the information we got came from our interviews related to information control and surveillance. And some people were talking about how they only had enough power for one local device, using it at night, and what they did was watching foreign content, what would be illicit content. And in the recent upticks of different laws in North Korea popping up, such as the anti-reactionary thought law in December 2020, where we can see punishments are increasing related to watching illicit content and in various different natures. So I do think there is some truth to that, but I think it's too soon to tell exactly what they mean by this. It could just be the aesthetics. It could be that they want to show a very neatly arrayed and curated Pyongyang on their TV, but we'll be watching it very closely.
Yeah,
Great.
Esther, can I add something as well to that?
Yeah, please.
I mean, what Natalia just said about the aesthetics of things, if you think about some of the slides she showed from Pyongyang, those solar panels on the side of the buildings did look awfully messy. So I can see, definitely that's something that, if you live in an HOA in the US, they would never allow you to do anything like that. So there is certainly that side of it. I spoke to Colin at NK News when he was writing the report yesterday, and he was asking me some questions as well. One of the arguments was that it seems to be more efficient, and on its face that is true. If you have a solar panel, once your battery is powered, all of the energy that solar panel is producing is not being used for anything because the battery is charged. So it definitely makes sense to connect these up, because then you can put more load on them so that as one battery charges up, another one starts charging. That kind of thing makes sense. And that seems to be the way they're selling it. But also, that's only going to be a benefit to people if the state doesn't start sucking away some of that power to send to factories or to send to, government offices or whatever, wherever they want to send it. Because if these things sort of become part of the grid, then there's a chance that what will happen is the state will just turn around and say, well, there's no electricity tonight because we need to run this factory. And people will have lost their ability to control their own supply. So if I was in North Korea, I would not be very happy about the idea of the government taking over control of my solar panel, because the entire reason I got it was because they were doing such a bad job at getting me electricity. But again, it's like, who knows what's going to happen? It's way too early.
No, Martin, you bring up a really good point, and I think we can see a kind of pattern to that based on the cooperative farms that were introduced fairly recently, where a lot of farmers are meant to be able to keep the surplus, but we don't really know what's happening with that. It could be taken directly from the state to the state. So
Thanks for that. I will say, never imagined a North Korean HOA, but it certainly does not inspire a lot of good thoughts. Bob, I'd like to turn to you, because I think, we've talked a lot about solar energy, hydro energy, and a little bit of thermal energy, but kind of the other, I think, big elephant in the room, obviously, is nuclear energy. And you were intimately involved with the Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization, KEDO, and trying to manage the light water reactors that were promised as part of the agreed framework. And so I want to invite you to kind of join this conversation, and would love to hear a little bit more about, what you thought if the light water reactors, kind of what gap they would have filled, and do you think that they would have been as effective in supplying the energy to North Korea? And what give us some color here?
I think if you think of North Korea as one gigantic HOA, you'll have a better sense of the balance of control and initiative, individual initiative. Before I start, I want to say how happy I am to see a project that's actually focused on something other than military in North Korea. It's really important that we pay attention to the economy. There's a lot more going on there than people realize, and this question of the electric grid and electric power is obviously a big part of it. That, as far as I'm concerned, the North Koreans have never tried to hide the fact, even from their own people, who knew it intimately anyway, that they have a big power problem, and we're trying to fix it and couldn't fix it. That's sort of a separate issue. The competence and resources. The sanctions have actually done a good job of interrupting the development of their power sector, because they can't get parts for a replacement part for hydro. Their thermal plants are old. We supplied them with heavy fuel oil, which helped degrade the plants, as a matter of fact. So it's not an excuse. It's just that they didn't have the best possible situation to move ahead. One interesting statistic I dug up, and it's really important, although it seems like a long time ago. In 1971, in South Korea, only 20% of the rural population had any access to electricity at all. Okay, it's 50 years ago, but it's not that long ago. And the point is, it's not unusual for countries to develop the capital and the urban area first and the rural areas later. I think the North Korean view is we need to do more with the rural areas, but they're going to have to wait a little bit longer. Which raises the question in my mind, when they bring farmers in, busloads of farmers in from the countryside to see Pyongyang, do these people look around and their jaws drop and say, oh, this is so wonderful, look, we're going to get this ourselves? Or do they say, son of a bitch, look at what these people have and we don't have anything? I don't quite know what the emotional reaction is, but the regime seems to think bringing people in to see how far they've come is a good idea. That's the purpose of the television as well. Doesn't pull the wool over anybody's eyes. The nuclear has been a long-term play by the North Koreans. Their view was they didn't want to be reliant on foreign oil. And after the oil shock in the 70s, they really decided they didn't like that idea. And they were convinced that their coal was going to run out sooner or later. So they needed nuclear. And beginning in the mid-80s, they tried every way they could to get light water reactors. They went to the Canadians, they went to the Soviets at that time. They thought they had a deal with the Soviets. Boris Yeltsin just killed it. And so they ended up with the 2 light water reactors from the United States through this Kido organization. We learned a lot working with the North Koreans on this project. First of all, they had to sign 8 protocols, very complex protocols that governed the site itself. You can find them on the Kido website, kido.org. It still exists, as a matter of fact. But if you look at the protocols and you look at how complicated they are, and they had to be negotiated, and then understand that the North Koreans stuck to them, it gives you a sense of what might still be possible if we get back in to work cooperatively on projects. They know, they have these in their file, they understand what will have to be done. The other thing we learned is that they are very good engineers. They're not ideologues. They try to keep up with best practices. They study hard, they work very hard, and they understand their own situation better than we do. And it's very important not to go in and lecture to them, because some of the things we say to them, they already know, and other things that we say to them aren't applicable. So if we ever get back in there, we're going to have to keep our ears and eyes open, it seems to me, to make allowances for their own, what sometimes seem to be silly requests or demands. In addition to nuclear, as a matter of fact, and solar, there are lots of other things that need to be done in the area of electric power for the North Koreans. Obviously, and I think Martin mentioned this, they need a grid upgrade, but that's very expensive, and they can't pay for it, and so that's going to have to have international participation, and someone has to sign the check for that. That's a problem. They need energy conservation buildings retrofitted to become more energy efficient. And one question I have, and the only way to find out is to have someone on the ground, is are these new apartments that are going up, thousands and thousands of them, are they energy efficient? Are they built in order to conserve energy or to help with cooling, things like that? They know about those things, and so the question is, have they implemented them? We don't know that. I have great respect for defectors, but I also have a little bit of concern. I was in North Korea a lot, and I have to say that when you're there and walking the streets, and not just in the capital, it looks very different than it does on that nighttime map picture. I don't like those from space pictures for a lot of reasons. I'm glad Martin said we don't want to compare North and South Korea. It's just a ridiculous comparison. But people do it. Donald Rumsfeld loved to do it, right? To compare these things. North Korea is much bigger than South Korea. It's much emptier than South Korea. If you saw a nighttime map of Kansas and you didn't know what it was, you might say, oh my God, they've got an electricity problem in Kansas. Well, they don't. They've got population centers, and North Korea has very small cities. So you need to be partially you need to be on the ground to test this stuff. It doesn't negate the idea they've got electricity problem, but you got to get it in a more nuanced context if you can. I think that was it. I think the bottom line is that to the extent that Kim Jong-un is still serious about his economy, and to the extent that I think there's an interesting correlation between suddenly seeing a big uptick in the use of the solar cells and Kim's reforms, such that, for example, factory owners were able to make their own decisions to spend their money on those things that would increase productivity. I have a feeling some of them decided, oh, I need solar cells, and they could pay for them. That goes into the banking reform so that there was money available. So this whole process is interconnected. And it seems to me that's an opening at some point that we might be able to step into, to have some presence and maybe some influence in development. I don't think we're there right now, but it's something to look forward to.
Yeah. Thanks, Bob, for that. And I think something that you said tees up us nicely for something I'd like to turn to Anne to discuss, and that is, you mentioned there's a lot of needs to really upgrade North Korea's electricity system, and you mentioned the need for a grid upgrade and how expensive that is. And it sounds like there's a lot of other investments that are needed, especially on its hydro projects, et cetera. So, and kind of in an ideal world, what are the opportunities for cooperation in building up North Korea's energy sector? Oh, Anne, I think you're muted.
I think I need to unmute. So this is a really challenging question, and especially people like Bob and Joel Witt and Gary Seymour and Bob Gallucci and the team that was on the ground and negotiating with the North Koreans know how difficult it is. And many other NGOs that have tried to go in and help, whether with medical assistance or any number of other projects over the years, sometimes found themselves in jail, sometimes found themselves abruptly ejected from the country for no particular reason. So to my mind, it still remains a very high risk place to try to make a positive difference. That doesn't mean a positive difference can't be made, but certainly the ground on the North Korean side has to be fertile for those ideas to land and take root. And that is going to be, I think, a very difficult point to determine because of the kind of erratic behavior that, well, you could call it erratic or you could call it exquisitely planned. It's one or the other. But the behavior that we see on a pretty consistent basis is discouraging. I think governments would very much like to see something move forward. But it was interesting in the report, I saw that, it said that, if we're going to really do this seriously, it would take a group of countries and probably the 6 parties would have to reunite. Well, if there's going to be something happening in North Korea, it's probably not going to be with Russia anymore, or else nobody else is going to be in the room. And that's going to also have an impact on where North Korea lands. We don't know what the result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is going to be, but I think most of the countries that would be involved in perhaps funding things for North Korea are currently not on Russia's side. So, that introduces some very interesting dynamics to this particular discussion, because Russia has always had that link to North Korea through many different channels. I remember back in the mid-90s, a group of Russian rocket scientists being held up at the airport en route to North Korea, probably not just to lecture on aerodynamics. So there is that very complicated relationship there, and I think we're going to have to see how that develops. When I was at the State Department, I was really on the periphery of the people like Bob and Gary and Joel, who were directly involved in the 6-party talks and negotiations. But when I moved to the National Academy of Sciences and the Committee on International Security and Arms Control, Joel Witt came by one day and said, "Hey, don't you think we could put together an interesting project on North Korea to look at options?" And I've been digging for a couple of days trying to find that paper, because there were some very, very specific things. And a lot of it was aimed at how do you take what the North Koreans know and can do and either turn it into serious science or monetize it. For example, we had somebody from the radiopharmaceutical industry involved, and his point was, hey, if they have a research reactor, they could produce Moly 99 with some help from, people on the outside. It could go into one of the economic zones for processing, packaging, distribution, but money could flow back into North Korea because they produce the material. There was another idea, and this was specifically associated to taking down facilities, that you take some of the scientists involved and you get them engaged in a large scale environmental remediation and analysis program. You provide them with a top class analytical laboratory. You pair them up with scientists from around the world, and you make it a serious undertaking, and you give them credit and visibility for it. And there were about 5 or 6 other ideas, in a similar vein. And unfortunately, it was not too long after we had that series of meetings, a number of which were in Seoul with South Korean partners, that things kind of turned south, and we just never had a chance to take any of that forward. I did want to add one more thing about the energy side. So even though my job at the Department of Energy and NNSA was non-proliferation, you do not work in the Department of Energy without absorbing something about energy. And the process of efficiently and effectively mixing different energy sources is not an easy one. You can't just grab a little solar, a little hydro, a little thermal, a little nuclear, throw it all in on a grid and expect it to work. These are highly difficult technical challenges. You've got the dependence of both solar and wind on weather. And you may be counting on a certain percentage of your grid input to be coming from solar, and then there's a dust storm coming in from China that's going to last for 2 weeks and it's gone. Or, as we mentioned before, river levels may drop to such a low point that you can't generate the requirement from hydro any longer. And dams break, dams explode, things happen. And so you have to have a base load of some sort that's going to be normally thermal or nuclear. And that your solar and your wind are supplements to that, more than the core energy inputs. So, that's another set of challenges. And then the grid is a very good question. Is North Korea perhaps a country that is more suitable to local or mini or even microgrids? Maybe that would work better in a country where there are city centers, but then distributed towns. Maybe you don't need to have a large grid. Maybe it's just a few windmills and some solar panels, but maybe that gives you 8 hours a day of reliable energy, which is better than maybe 1 hour a year. So I think you have to look at different gradations of what you can provide and where. And if you could provide some of that, for example, in a kind of micro setting in the rural areas, make those people happier. You also keep those people happier without creating large generation that can be siphoned off by the government into programs that we would not want to be supporting. So I think there's a lot of room for creativity here in terms of how you could design a map and lay out the different options depending on what community gets more than 200 days of sunlight a year. Where are there consistent winds? If we had the Texas Panhandle everywhere, nobody would need anything but wind power. So those are things that you could break down. And I don't know how good the data is on those kinds of things in North Korea, the meteorological data, but that's that gives you a very good clue as to how you could construct things in different parts of the country.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Anne, for giving us a lot of food for thought about different options available. I'm cognizant of time, so I'd love to kind of turn it over to the audience because we do have a few questions that have come in. And, Bob and Anne, I think these questions will be mostly directed towards Natalia and Martin, but certainly if you would like to jump in on any of these, definitely flag me down. But we have a question from Alexander, and he or she asks, North Korea is banned from buying turbine generators for their hydroelectric dam by the UN sanctions. If North Korea wasn't banned from buying turbine generators, would North Korea be able to utilize this electricity more? And I don't know if you guys have an answer to this, Martin.
Yeah, we did look into this side of things, and I'm definitely not a sanctions expert, so I can't speak to I don't know if all turbines are banned or specific ones or anything like that. I mean, in terms of would North Korea be able to equalize it to a more extent when compared to South Korea? The graph I showed at the beginning, South Korea is something like 13 or 14 times more electricity generation. So while any power generation in North Korea would help, it has a long way to go. But also, in fact, as Bob was saying, North Korea is doesn't have the same population as South Korea, so it doesn't necessarily need to generate the same level as South Korea. But I think there's still quite a long way to go to actually sort of get them to equivalent levels. But I'm afraid I don't know sanctions in detail to be able to answer that question. I do know that there is some. Certainly North Korean media reports a lot on retrofitting of turbines and on increasing the efficiency of turbines. I don't know if there are any turbines that are built completely in the DPRK, but certainly they seem to be working on and trying to get more out of the ones they do have.
Yeah, well, maybe a topic for a future report.
If I could just quickly on sanctions. Normally things are sanctioned because they have more than one use. So, if these are normally dual use items, so they may have a very advantageous civilian application, but they no doubt also have military applications. So I think until you see a behavior change by North Korea, I would very highly doubt that there would be a change to the sanctions regime. Bob may have something else to add.
You don't want to get me started on sanctions. So
Okay, well, we'll put a pin on the sanctions conversation. We have two questions here that I think are a little bit similar, and I'll throw these over to you, Natalia. But we have one from Silgi Park and David Bartlett about kind of where are the solar panels that are being used by households made? Are they made in North Korea? Are they importing raw critical materials necessary to make the cells? And then similarly, a question kind of where are they manufactured, or are any manufactured in North Korea, or are they all being imported from China?
Yeah, so we've seen evidence of, and we've heard from defector testimony saying that they sometimes are importing from China, depending on the price. But like I said earlier, the price became a little bit better after the 2012 Pyongyang International Trade Fair. And then we started seeing more production of smaller panels and more of a state encouragement of utilizing these personal panels in North Korea. So we do know that they are being produced and manufactured in North Korea as well as China. But for some people, it may depend on the distance to a major city or production facility, in North Korea versus if they can get it for trade across the border with China. So for some people, I think it's a matter of convenience and cost. I'm not very familiar with the sanctions on raw critical metals that are necessary for making the cells. I do know that they are importing a lot of materials from China just generally, but that's kind of out of the scope of my research. But Martin, do you want to chime in on anything about the in-house production?
Yeah, so let me just reshare. Here we are. Let me just reshare the picture that I showed earlier, which is from I think this is the Kim Il Sung, or is this no? This is the State Academy of Sciences. Sorry, but there's a very similar production lines we've seen at the Kim Il Sung solar plant. You can see on the table here. If you think about a solar panel, it has all these individual solar cells that are kind of usually square shaped. And that's what's in front of this engineer here. And if you look on the desk in front of her, these seem to be in some sort of plastic, blister wrap packaging. So one of the possibilities is that these individual cells are coming in from overseas, or possibly that they're being made in North Korea, but that's how they're wrapped. But I'm not sure North Korea has the capacity to do these. They might be buying those in and then making the larger panels in country. Certainly some are being imported, but we also have, if you look at Natalia's story, and I'm gonna drop a link in the chat. If you go to her story and scroll down, we've got some pictures of solar panels all sort of piled up in the factory. I think it's the Kim Il Sung University factory. And there you see some larger panels, but you also see kind of some smaller ones with handles on them that are the sort of individual size ones. So certainly I think some of this production is going on in the country. Quite how much it's difficult to tell. So it's probably a mixture of import and of production, but the raw materials, even for the North Korean panels, the raw materials might be being imported. So those individual cells.
Yeah, that actually that makes me think of another question, and I don't know if you guys will have an answer to this, but I mean, your conversations and the research you've been doing, we all know that trade has increased dramatically in the pandemic. And I imagine solar panels and all of these other power stations require a lot of maintenance and upkeep. And do you see evidence that there is a detrimental effect to solar panel systems and these other power stations?
You mean in relation to the pandemic?
Well, like trade, lack of trade access.
Oh, I see.
Materials from China, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, certainly a lot of the construction and a lot of this expansion continued going on during the pandemic, because apart from those, what was it, 3 months or something, there was, officially no COVID. And I think even if there was COVID, it wasn't at a very substantial level, except for those 3 months when the government really sort of seemed to fear it. So a lot of this stuff continued. But the trade, certainly different parts of North Korea's economy is suffering because of the closure of the border with China, both illicit and legitimate trade. There's been very little happening during the pandemic. And in fact, the borders are still mostly closed, although there is now some official importing by rail and by sea. But I think it certainly had an impact.
Yeah, thanks. We have a question here from Tracy Wilson, who asks if North Korea has explored geothermal power generation in addition to solar. And if I could just tack on, maybe this is also a good opportunity to maybe preview some of the upcoming work that you're doing on wind and wave, I believe.
Yeah. So geothermal, there is some geothermal. We've seen it. We didn't write about it in this story because we were more looking at electricity generation. But the geothermal that we have seen tends to be restricted to certain establishments. So I think the SciTech complex in Pyongyang uses geothermal for its air conditioning. And I remember seeing that the central bank building used geothermal, I think for water heating. I think to heat water, I don't remember. It's kind of, you know, sometimes mentioned at the end or on the edge of the reports about solar use. So there is some geothermal, but I don't think any of it is large scale. Certainly if it is, it hasn't been talked about, and it's not something that comes up an awful lot. In terms of other types of power generation, though, you know, one of the things that was just mentioned was how much of North Korea actually gets, you know, good sunlight for solar. We looked into this. The World Bank does this great survey of solar potential for pretty much everywhere around the world. I think that's where I learned that the UK has, I think, the second worst amount of sunlight in the world after Ireland. It was right at the bottom of the list. It made me very sad. But they did this great survey, and there's a map that we reproduced in one of our solar reports, which shows the areas of the country that, by satellite analysis, because of course you can't do this on the ground for the entire planet, but by satellite analysis, are the best areas to put panels in. And that's a lot of the sort of eastern side of North Korea, gets very good sunlight and is relatively flat before you get to the mountains. So they're good places for solar farms and things like that. And then we've been looking at, we're about to publish something on wind and wave power. Wind is something, there are some relatively large wind turbines in North Korea, but the most we've seen together is sort of 3 or 4. You know, there's not huge wind fields like you see in other countries. And then there are a lot of smaller wind turbines that seem to be used just for smaller buildings to be a supplemental form of power generation. The interesting one, though, is wave. Wave has been talked about quite a lot, but the only wave facility that we've been able to locate is a single one in the West Sea Barrage, the big, you know, a dam barrage on the West Sea, and apparently it's built into the structure. But North Korea has talked about wave power, and one of the reasons it talks about wave power is apparently the tidal swell up and down. In that part of the world is some of the largest in the world. So that also seems like something that if they could get the technology right, and if they could figure out how to build that, that would seem to be something that would be quite promising, because they do have the sort of geographical conditions for that. But it's not something that we've seen a lot of experimentation on, and we've looked quite a lot. It's very rarely spoken about, but it does seem to be something that they mention as a future project.
Yeah. Thank you for that. We have a question here from Ryan Russell. He asks, are there ways to bifurcate the potential dual-use nature of energy investments in North Korea that would enable private investment in power generation and T&D?
I don't know if anyone else has any better ideas on that. There might be some clever ways to sort of, you know, on the dual use side of things, there might be some clever ways to do that. I was sort of thinking that, but it was when I got to the private investment part of the question. Almost every private investment in North Korea has ended up in disaster for the foreign partner. So maybe private investment isn't the way to go. Maybe there's another way, but I don't know. I'd be interested to hear if maybe Anne or Bob have any ideas about if there's any way to sort of cleverly do something so that we can sort of negate or at least lessen the dual use potential, or maybe that's just not the point of the sanctions anyway.
Yep.
Yeah, you both put your hands up. Perfect.
And turn it over to you.
So I'll start, and then Bob, please jump in. I think, to me, the biggest part of that question is the private nature of it, because unless you're an Elon Musk or someone of equivalent billionaire status, and losing a few $1 billion doesn't really make any difference. The issue of insurance, protection of your investment, all of those things will have to be factored in if it's a private investment. And, unless it's a foundation that's just simply willing to take the risk. But the risk environment in North Korea is so very high. I think it would be extremely difficult to parse out, okay, well, you could do this and this, and then anything on that side would be considered dual use, but everything over here is fine. It's extremely hard to make that kind of distinction.
Thanks, Anne. Bob?
If the question was, can you have energy generated, which you can be sure only goes to non-military uses? The answer is yes, you can create an energy island. I even think they may have had something like that in the Kaesong economic zone. I'm not positive, but anyway, you have a local generator of electricity, and then the grid for it is isolated from the main grid, and you can be sure where it's going. So I think that's quite possible. It probably won't be too large scale, but for local, industrial type facilities, I think you can do it.
Well, I like the possibility. We have a question here, another question from David Bartlett, and he asks, does North Korea import any power directly from China? As in, are there electric wires running across the border? If not, what would prevent such an arrangement? I think, Natalia, you mentioned in one of your reports, maybe it was Martin, about actually North Korea selling electricity to China. So I'd love to hear more on that.
Yeah, I just pulled the data up actually. Let me see if I can share my web browser here. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes. So this is from our story. So there are several hydropower stations along the Yalu River that are jointly operated by North Korea and China. North Korea takes half the power, China takes half the power. North Korea sells power to China. We looked at the Chinese trade statistics, and we came up with this graph that is awfully uneven. So I'm not exactly sure what defines whether China's buying, whether it's China's needs or whether it's North Korea's needs. But at the moment, I think it's technically possible for North Korea to import electricity, but of course it costs money. So mostly the trade is an outflow. I don't think in the trade statistics there was any electricity coming across the border. So this was in 2021, North Korea sold 413 gigawatt hours of electricity to China, for which they got about 17 million US. Based on the estimates from Nautilus, which are the estimates we have for the total power generation in the country, because the government doesn't publish that, that's about 3% of its annual power generation that is sold to China. So that's another sort of way that it kind of makes the situation worse, even though, of course, it sort of benefits the North Korean government by getting that $17 million.
Yeah. Bob, do you want to jump in here?
The Chinese would have to be crazy to connect their grid to the North Korean grid. The North Korean grid is so unstable that if and when it went down, it would bring the Chinese grid with it, unless you have some sort of a buffering interface so that the Chinese wires only go so far and then they're sort of separated from the North Korean, and then the North Korean picks up the electricity. I don't know how expensive that would be. There's a good reason for the North Koreans to be part of a larger grid. For example, when the hydro goes down in North Korea because of the winter, there's electricity, used to be electricity available in the Russian grid that they could have used. So at some point, when the lions and the lambs lie down together, a larger Northeast Asian national grid could make some sense, but that's a ways in the future.
Got it. Thanks for that, Bob. We have one last audience question here, which Bob, don't mute yourself yet. Alexander asks, North Korea already has an experimental light water reactor at Yongbyon, the nuclear complex. Does North Korea still have a long way on utilizing nuclear power as one of their main sources of energy? Oh, you just muted yourself.
Okay, I'm unmuted. We simply don't know why they cannot get that LWR up. It's an experimental LWR. They need to get it up and fiddle around with it before they know how to use them. When that happens, they can build some more of them. But this thing went into started coming up out of the ground, and I saw it in 2010. So that's 13 years ago. And they don't have any environmental constraints or bureaucratic problems. They just having some sort of a hardware problem. So once they get it up, then they'll be at the starting line. But right now, no, nothing. I don't know why they don't build more graphite moderated reactors. They know how to do that. Apparently they can do that. They're not great electricity producers, but they were going to build a great big one in Taechon before the agreed framework shut it down. For some reason, they've decided they don't want to do that. Can I make one small comment? Natalia raised the point that, well, people may not want to end up having to pay for the electricity if they can get it free, with their own solar panels. That's the real world, paying for your electricity. That would actually bring North Koreans into the real world because they couldn't waste electricity. If you have to pay for it, you have to figure out what's important to you, where you turn on the lights and where you don't, things like that. That's the whole problem with the North Korean economic system. And it's what the leadership was trying to fix. If everything is free, then people don't pay attention to what they're spending money on. If it costs money, then they have to start making choices. And that's what the leadership wanted to do a couple of times with the reforms. They didn't push them all the way through. That was a problem. But when you hear North Koreans complaining about, well, they have to pay for this and that, I have to say to myself, hello, that's what we have to do in the real world,
Yeah, thanks for that, Bob. We have just a handful of minutes left, so I thought I might just quickly turn it back over to you all to share any final reflections that you might have. So Martin, I'd like to start with you, just a minute or less, kind of any final thoughts.
Yeah, obviously, just to remind people, all these articles are up on our website, 38 North, and we've got a couple more to come. So please look at those if you're interested in learning more about this. Yeah, I think one of the things that sort of doing this research and looking into it has taught me is that this can be a very, the North Korean economy can be a very abstract subject sometimes and a very sort of large subject to talk about. But the way that we started this, talking to the individual North Koreans, it was really extraordinary, the sort of lack of electricity that they have and that they manage to live their lives. And that, like through these solar panels that Natalia's been talking about, they've sort of managed to innovate and it really is a sort of jerry-rigged system. They've got a panel with wires going to a battery, and then they're running things up a battery. And as Bob said, the electricity grading, when there is electricity, is unstable. We talked to someone that said that the chargers for cell phones burn out every 6 months because they're not designed to work on something as bad as the North Korean system, and the electricity is up and down all over the place. So they just end up burning out. So, another example of the sort of tremendously hard life that North Koreans live through no fault of their own for, the general population.
Yeah, thanks. Natalia?
Yeah, I think going off of that, doing all of this research has really driven home the idea of North Koreans just being extremely resilient and having this ingenuity to just create where there's nothing. So it's been really interesting to be able to have the privilege to talk to people who have been on the ground and ask them about their experiences of how they dealt with this in their day-to-day lives, especially with the juxtaposition of potentially defecting to South Korea or another country nearby. But I will say none of this would have been possible without a totally separate project where we then found new project ideas coming out. And I think I just want to plug another project that's somewhat related to this, and that's the North Korean Economic Journal translations that Bob and our other non-resident fellow, Rachel Min-Young Lee, had been slaving over for the past few years. And I kind of want to drive home how important viewing North Korea is in a more holistic context, right? We've learned so much about North Korea based on what they've published and what they've made available. And in getting more access to their TV, their state media, translating these into English and making them more widely available, we can only go up from here. So I'm just really, every time we leave these discussions, I get even more excited to just kind of hunker down and do even more research. So I'm just looking forward to more conversations. Thank you.
Thanks. Anne? Oh, you're muted.
I want to plug that project too, because when we were doing the work at the National Academies, that was one of the main sources of input that we had, were all those different translations and websites. And, you know, it is really what you have to work with. Not many of us have had the experience that Bob has had to be in country so many times, and things do change. And you have to try to keep perspectives fresh, or at least as fresh as you can when you're dealing with such a closed society, if you're ever going to come up with ideas that will somehow break the logjam that we're in right now and allow for true progress.
Thanks, Anne. And last but certainly not least, Bob.
If anyone tells you North Korea is a black hole, you can laugh, it seems to me. As Natalia said, we're learning more and more. There's more available. It takes a lot of time and a lot of tears and sweat to do the work, but it's not unknowable. And if we're ever going to fix the problem, that's what we got to do. So, Natalia, we'll do whatever we can. I think this is a great project. I think everybody should be glad to see it and encourage more of this sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Bob. I'll just echo a sentiment that you shared at the top, that it is really refreshing, I think, to see kind of the conversation on North Korea, not just about kind of the military issues and discuss, you know, energy, which I will admit I am by no means an expert on at all. So I've certainly learned a lot from you all in these reports, and I look forward to seeing where the research takes you and the new projects that you guys all find on this. And we really rely on the time that you spend to do this. So thank you so much. And thank you to our audience for sticking with us here late in the United States and early in South Korea. We hope that you'll check out all the resources that have been listed here. But on behalf of the Stimson Center and the 38 North Project, thank you so much for joining, and take care.